Okay, great. Okay, so there's a little bit of housekeeping, or not housekeeping. Now I'm going to go into a little bit of introduction. So thank you everyone for joining. Very excited to be talking about privacy and security in the metaverse today. I've been thinking a lot about this topic actually for a couple of months now. This all started because I sent a LinkedIn poll asking if people were interested in this topic, and I got quite a bit of a response. And so I decided, well, let's just go ahead and start doing it. Let's talk about it. So thank you again for joining. I am Caroline McCaffrey. I am the CEO of a company called ClearUps, and we are sponsoring this webinar series. It's a 6-part series, and we are sponsoring it with the Security Expert Marketplace. Just a little bit about ClearUps, which hope you don't mind if I do just a quick little screen share of a brochure about ClearUps, but we are a knowledge management platform for privacy and security operations. We essentially collect all the data that you have about your company's privacy and security operations, and then we help you perform tasks with that data. So those tasks can include things like, if you can mute yourself, I'd appreciate it. I don't know who that is, but yeah, we help you perform tasks such as responding to questionnaires and vendor management. So just a quick little something about ClearUps, that's the brochure. So with that out of the way, I am now going to start the webinar itself by introducing our guest, our featured guest. So Allison, who is here on the call with me, I actually first heard Allison speaking at an IAPP. IAPP stands for International Association of Privacy Professionals conference that was in 2018. And she presented on privacy in blockchain. She is a blockchain expert. I learned so much from that session that she gave at the IAPP conference. I wrote a ton of notes and I have referred to them many times since. And so when we started thinking about putting together this webinar, I couldn't think of a better person than to ask her, because when it comes to blockchain technology, in my opinion, blockchain is all about security, but maybe not quite so much about privacy. So I am really, really thrilled that Allison agreed to talk with us today, talk with me, talk to all of you. And so I'm going to let Allison talk a little bit about herself, but as I said, couldn't have a better authority to start thinking about these issues. Allison.
Thank you so much. That's such a nice introduction. And yeah, you know, it's you bring up a good point about the privacy versus security. It's always dividing factions, and I'm excited to talk about it with everybody today. So a little bit about me. I've worked in the tech industry for 24 years now. I have a computer science degree, electrical engineering background, and have built and worked on software and hardware for my entire career. Over the last 8 years or so, 9 years, focused very specifically on decentralized systems. First at the hardware level, with a product we built that created mesh networks, which is a type of peer-to-peer radio network technology that doesn't require a central hub to communicate. And then we moved more into how do we industrialize that. So we moved into bringing about trust into these large systems, and blockchain technology, among some other things, became a very key piece of that. So because of that last 8 or 9 years of working in this space, we've had to get caught up significantly on the ramifications around this new technology, the pros and the cons. And so I'm really excited to kind of dig into it with you today. Thank you for having me.
I muted myself so that you didn't hear anything I was doing, but then I had to go unmute myself. Okay, great. So I am going to launch a quick little poll just so that we know who is in the audience. It's just 2 questions. I'm going to give you guys a second to review the poll and quickly answer it. But essentially, I just want to get a sense of who is here so that we can make sure that we tailor this conversation to what you're interested in and what you're doing. Mostly when we put together this overview webinar, we thought to ourselves, well, actually, I didn't even think to myself this. I got a comment on that LinkedIn poll I told you about where it said, someone said, I don't even know what the metaverse means. So I don't feel like I'm qualified to even attend a discussion on privacy and security in the universe, in the metaverse. And I thought, well, that's not good. We got to at least make sure that we have a session at the beginning that kind of goes through some of the different terms, subcategories, whatever you want to call it, glossary about the metaverse and tangentially, I think Web3, and in addition to starting to identify the different privacy and security issues. So the poll has been live for about a minute. It looks like most people here are worried about privacy and security in the metaverse. I am too. You'll see a lot of posts from me about that. And then most people are not building in the metaverse. So very interesting. Thank you again for answering that poll. So Allison, let's talk about the first thing that most people ask when it comes to the metaverse, which is, what is the metaverse?
What is the metaverse? Yeah, it's actually a really important question because it seems like it should be obvious to those who may be familiar with it. It seems fairly obvious, I think. But for many of us, and myself included, even up until recently, it's still a little bit nuanced and kind of mushy. I would define the metaverse as the combination of virtual reality and augmented reality, which we'll get into those in a moment. The environments in which they create when you use them become a type of alternate universe or a metaverse, right? Do you consider it a physical location? Well, not really. Is a website a physical location? Not really, but it is a destination, right? We even use URLs, else in the URL stands for location, right? So it is a place you go to visit. And so just like the web, the internet has locations, so does the metaverse, virtual reality and augmented reality. We call this location the metaverse. That's my best definition of how it can be. There might be some more nuanced or academic explanations around it, but that's how I understand it. And most of the people that I interact with seem to agree.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard some people talk about it in a way of, when you think of the universe, this is like the planetary explanation, and I'm curious as to your thoughts of this. So I've heard that people talk about the metaverse as a universe is full of planets. And so the metaverse is sort of we're no longer in these, we're no longer operating on the internet in our own planet. Now you can jump between planets pretty easily. And I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I've not considered or heard that before. That's interesting. Planets are still bound by like the laws of gravity and like only being in one location at a time. And so metaverse, much like the internet, you can open up multiple tabs on a web browser and be in multiple locations almost the same time. The metaverse also is not limited by our physical, Newtonian physics, if you will. So yeah, I could see that as another description of how it works. But I think because it's as important and it will become increasingly important and popular, much like the original internet was, it does beg the question around like, what do we as a society want to start thinking about this metaverse in terms of security and privacy, and what's the type of future we want to have in that? Because it is coming. Many people are probably familiar with Oculus, which is a product that Facebook purchased, and Oculus is a VR headset. Now Meta, I guess we call them, which is convenient for metaverse. But that had very strong record sales over Christmas, and it's becoming very popular. And then of course, Apple then announced they are coming out with their own virtual reality, augmented reality product that will arguably compete with Oculus. And so these big major players are making big moves in this space. It's going to be here soon. We should probably start talking about what that means, ethics and privacy and security, and how we want to approach that.
I mean, you just introduced two topics in privacy and security that comes to the metaverse, right? One is the big players leading the metaverse and the potential. I mean, I'm worried about a lot of things to do with that. And the other one is the physical devices that are now tracking us in ways that we haven't been tracked before. I heard someone say yesterday that Apple is doing maybe you just said this, but anyway, the AirPods with biometrics in the AirPods. So they're reading your ear canal.
Yes.
I mean,
I read that too. It's bonkers, right? I mean, the more wearables and things like that. I mean, we are walking fingerprints. That's not a good example. We have fingerprints. Everything we do as humans can be pretty quickly uniquely identifiable. So we almost have like human print. I don't know what the term would be, but like there's a sense of like our uniqueness in the way we interact with the world, who we are. I mean, and humans use this too, hair color, face, like that's how we identify each other as uniqueness. We know one person from another because of that, but computers are really good at doing that at large scale. And as you start to track more uniqueness, there's more opportunity for abuse, and also positive things in some ways. But having a structure or framework around how we talk about that and what's up for grabs, I think is a really good place to start, because we've seen what happens in the past if it's just kind of a free for all and a general big tech push to try to capture eyeballs or impressions or, sentiment. Better or worse, a lot of these companies are driven by profit margins and quarterly earnings reports. And so they will be motivated by increasing those, unless there's some guardrails that we as society decide we want to have in place within which they can then make profit,
Yeah. I mean, preaching to the choir on that one. That's exactly my concern.
Sure.
But I think we have to, before we go too deep into some of those issues, identifying the privacy and security issues, I think we do still have to do a little bit of a setup, which is what is the difference? You and I talked about this before that we actually had the session, but the difference between the metaverse and Web3, I think there's some confusion because there's overlap, but not, I don't know. It's hard to kind of distinguish when someone's saying, well, let's talk about Web3 versus let's talk about the metaverse.
Right. Yeah. So Web3, to my knowledge, was coined by a individual named Gavin Wood. He was a co-founder of Ethereum, which is a popular cryptocurrency, and very smart guy. I've met him a couple times at conferences and whatnot, and very mindful and thoughtful person. So I mentioned that specifically because it's easy to throw scary ideas into a bucket and assume that everyone involved with them is nefarious or greedy or something. And it's really not the case, but because there's always humans behind this that are often trying to build great things. So Web3, as he defined it, is the ability for, just like Web 2. So let's go back a little bit. Web 1 was the .com era. There was pets.com and groceries.com and all these other things where everyone was trying to just kind of, Amazon was invented around then, same with Google, just getting what we call the information superhighway up and running, right? Which is such a goofy term today, but it's actually it was the metaverse of Web 1. That's what we called it.
That's right.
It allowed you to get online and actually do things and talk to people. And it was like, wow, I'm no longer stuck to one location. I can actually communicate with people all over the world for essentially free or very, very cheap. Web 2 came around, which was very popular in the 2000s with blogging and people publishing their own blogs or social media started to come around then as well, and really starting to kind of push self-publishing out. And if you think of Web 1 as kind of like a centralized, like I go to Amazon, Web 2 was kind of a pendulum swing over to like, can we make it more individually focused to push out, my own blog, my own thoughts, right? And someone could follow someone else's blog with RSS and all these technologies. Then comes along this kind of movement in social media to come back to centralized systems like with Facebook and with Instagram, where people stopped blogging as much as they used to, and they just publish on sites like Medium or Substack. They don't really have their own blogs anymore. So Web 2.0 started to kind of go away and it went more centralized. And now the swing back to Web 3, as Gavin defined it, is a swing back to decentralization, but instead of humans or people publishing information, they're now taking economic control or flexibility instead of information flexibility. Web 2 is all about pushing out information, words, content, things like that, where Web 3 is very much, can I be an independent economic actor? Can I actually buy and sell things? Can I create things? Can I make my own currency, like a cryptocurrency, and then use that to buy and sell things? Can I make these things called NFTs that represent some aspect of a digital piece that people might want to buy? And you can argue the pros and cons of that, but I think Web3 really does encapsulate an economic aspect of decentralization or individualization. And when you marry that with the metaverse, which is like, now I can be in a virtual environment and I can have my own economic capabilities, that's a pretty powerful duo. I don't think they're the same thing, but they're absolutely complementary to each other, I believe.
Yeah, that's such a good way of explaining it. And it's like, really just makes me think so much about, I mean, as a privacy person, the first part of the economic independence that Web3 allows also makes me wonder about data independence. Absolutely. Right? Like, am I now, because data is the new oil was such a popular term, I would say, sort of when the big data era began and has been. So can part of that economic self-being be also that I have control of my data and therefore can use that as part of my economic exchange in Web3?
It's a great point. I mean, it's one of the troubles with decentralization. And as much as I love it, and spent a lot of my career working on decentralized protocols and hardware and platforms, decentralization often, not always, but often leads to consolidation over time because it's hard to run your own system. And so decentralization often starts off with very lofty goals, very idealistic groups of people that make really amazing technology leaps to make it work. But then it turns out that it's kind of hard to do those things, so it consolidates to a few big players. And then before you know it, it's now just a oligopoly of major providers, major tech companies that now provide it. And a good example of this is email. I'm one of those weirdo nerds that still runs my own mail server on my own computer. It's a virtual computer that's online, but it's that I host or that I pay for. But I absolutely run my own mail server, and everyone else I know, even other people who are technologists, all use Gmail. And email is probably the original decentralized platform. It was intended for people to run their own servers. If a server was down, it would retry the entire spec, which is now what, almost 40 years old, I guess. Maybe George would know. Is still very much like up and using, but almost everyone just doesn't want to host their own because it's actually a lot of work. And so when we think about decentralization in Web3, already we are seeing consolidation. Like there's only a couple of major API connection points that major Web3 tools like MetaMask wallets and these other things we can get into actually talk to the blockchain, right? The Ethereum blockchain.
Yep.
And so now those bottlenecks, those points of connection are actually bottlenecks or points of control or centralization. And then it's like, well, shoot, here we go. We've seen this pattern before, time and time again. And so with decentralization, you also have a concern around privacy, as you mentioned. Privacy and decentralization, I don't want to say they're diametrically opposed to each other, but they are often opposite sides of a seesaw. You can have lots of privacy in a single trusted system that no one knows about. But the more you have to decentrally try to trust and validate each other, you need to know about each other. And to know about each other, you need to reveal some unique information about each other so you know who you're interacting with. And so you almost always have this kind of like push-pull and decentralization of like public-private versus control over the platform versus relegating control to someone else for some other acceptance of privacy, whatever that might be. And then the worst case is delegating control to someone else, and then they still remove all the privacy and sell your data or whatever. And that's what we want to avoid, I think. At least I would like to avoid that as we get into the Metaverse and Web3.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ClearOps also uses our own mail server, which provides me so much comfort when people send me very secure things, even though I know it's not secure on their side. It's like, I know there's some third parties not in the middle with us.
Well, you're not going to get ads that are shown based on the content of that email, which is a nice thought, if nothing else, right?
But again, you sort of took me in two directions with your comment. The first was, I can't help but not mention the article that Moxie, the former CEO of Signal, wrote about how we're in Web3, we're talking about decentralization, but there already is centralization, specifically because people don't want to run their own servers anymore, right? So therefore you have to rely on someone else to, like the cloud, really just someone else's server is that centralized point.
That's right.
But then the other thing you made me think about is all these NFTs and the scams that we're starting, they're called rug pulls, but as far as I understand, but these scams, I mean, I feel like 2022 is going to be the year of NFT scams, like 2021 was the year of ransomware. Oh
yeah, very likely. It's already happening. It's only a month in. It's terrible. I mean, I don't know if you saw the hit piece debacle that came out yesterday morning, Tuesday morning, excuse me. Hit piece is a company, an NFT company that decided to mint NFTs, and we can talk about what that is in a little bit, but basically create NFTs of very many popular songs and digital and quite frankly, copyrights. So like Taylor Swift song, all across the board. I'm trying to think, there were just major artists that they just basically made an NFT, claimed the one-of-one digital representation of the song that they didn't write nor ask permission for, and then offered to sell it and then give the artist some of that money back if the artist agreed. You can imagine the blowback they got on Twitter. It was monumental in its in its negativity, and they had to shut down their website. And that various people who invested in this company were also outed and doxed in just the limit, just in the amount of like, this person's involved in this company. They weren't actually giving home addresses to my knowledge or anything, but the point is that it's becoming worse. And the benefit that Web3 offers of being able to add an economic layer to anything also can bring out some of the worst aspects of humanity in trying to monetize anything. And so there's kind of this like, even if it's not yours, which is basically theft or fraud, right? So that's very clearly illegal. I think that the current legal system can take care of that appropriately. But there's a lot of gray areas that the legal system doesn't know how to deal with. Like, we're just now getting the IRS up to speed on how to tax cryptocurrency gains, which, you can argue whether or not that's just magic internet money or is that real, but people are making real money off of it because other people are really buying it and selling it. And so lots of open questions. I don't know all the answers. And then it goes all the way back to privacy again. It's like, well, how do you manage privacy on a blockchain? If you're going to use that as your structure for your Web3 and Metaverse work, blockchains are not private, as you mentioned earlier. Most of them are not. Some can be, because you need to know who you're dealing with. And so you've got entire companies like chain analysis, I think they're called, that can determine who's where and when and who's paid whom. And it's a brave new world out there, for better or worse.
Well, I know your expertise is in blockchain, and I want to talk about that. But sure. Before we do, I want to say two things to the audience. One is, this is the discussion on NFTs and scams is one of the reasons why I really want security people and privacy people to start having these discussions and actually start to learn and jump in to the technology. Because as you said before, and as I've said before, last time around, we were sort of late to the technology. And I feel the skepticism that maybe some people have in our profession. In this case, we can't even afford to do it because things will happen so fast, like these NFT scams. Like, I can't imagine there's one security person out there who is glad that these NFTs are people are falling victim to these scams, especially if they had the power to stop it. Sorry for my rant. But the other thing that I did want to say to the audience is, if you do have a question and you want to kind of interrupt us, which is fine, just raise your hand, and then it should push you up into the top of where I'm looking at my screen, and we can pull you in to ask a question. But now to blockchain. So when I listened to you speak back in 2018 at the IAPP conference, you talked about blockchain. One of the things you said at that time that I will never forget is you were like, blockchain's kind of like at the DSL, stage right now. That was obviously many years ago. Yeah. But can you talk about some of the privacy innovations and security innovations in blockchain and where you see that going?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I still believe it's probably in late DSL stage today. Although it's starting to become, as Moxie and others have written about, it's starting to become somewhat inexcusable that it hasn't moved past that. It's been around. For those who are not familiar, the blockchain, as we consider it, its implementation, and it's what we call a blockchain today, was basically invented in 2009 in a white paper by a pseudonymous individual who basically described Bitcoin and described how Bitcoin should work. And so there was for all intents and purposes, the inventor of Bitcoin who invented the blockchain as well. And all the blockchain is a unique data structure. Think of it as like a specific type of database that has the ability for multiple people to run and use it with very clear indicators if it's been tampered with previous entries. And so if you think of it like an Excel spreadsheet ledger, you can keep adding rows to it. If someone tweaks an earlier row, for instance, like who has how much Bitcoin, everyone after it knows, and can actually reject that change. So that's kind of what a blockchain does. There's a lot more details to it. It was designed and meant for multiple people to interact together and have a trusted history of what has happened for the duration of the blockchain is run. So as you can imagine, in order to know if somebody's involved in something, you have to know who they are. So there's got to be a unique identity, which now you can start to see the privacy concerns. That was the original. That was the very first blockchain implementation. And then what happened is the blockchain started to become other ways to try to show trust in history. And so they started to wrap this entire study in this grouping called distributed ledgers or distributed ledger technology. You'll hear DLT, and that just means it includes blockchains and other structures like directed acyclic graphs, what we call DAGs. Anyways, there's a whole bunch of different nerdy computer science ways of doing this, which I find fascinating because they can introduce new capabilities like privacy. The original blockchain had no concept of privacy. Everyone had a very unique key. And when I say unique, I mean unique as in like, it would take you more than the number of atoms in the universe, number of tries to recreate that key. It's a very large bit, high entropy, very large size key. And that cryptographic key is how you do identity on the blockchain. And you can make multiples, but like there's only one of it of a kind. And if you send it to one, you can't get it back. It's not reversible. So to get to your question about what privacy gains have happened in the blockchain space or the DLT space recently, there's been, I guess, two that have been interesting to me, and I'm sure there's many more, but the two that have been on my radar is one is highly technical and one is a little more, I guess, pragmatic or practical. Let's start with the practical one. The practical one is that there's this concept of like side chains or sub chains. And this is really quite easy to think about. If you think about, there's one main ledger, and let's say you had two accounts on it, like yours and mine, and I gave you 1 Bitcoin, and then you gave me 1 Bitcoin, everyone can see that we gave each other 1 Bitcoin each. But if we do a side chain, what could happen is imagine having another spreadsheet and the cell links to that. And in that other one, we do a bunch of transactions on our own privately. And then maybe after a day or two, we reconcile that and just put the new balance back in the original one. The original one only sees 2 records, like whatever the starting one and whatever the reconciliation was. Whatever happened over here, including other people, private, or at least protected, right? So in the blockchain space, we call the original, Bitcoin blockchain a public chain. You have protected chains, which can include, it's usually a side chain that includes just a group of people, trusted individuals that you want to interact with, but not share with the broader public. And then you have completely private chains, which could be just basically single individuals doing their transactions directly and then reconciling at some other time. So that's called side chain. And if you actually connect a side chain to a main chain, that's usually called pegging to the original chain. And you can use that for making stable, non-volatile coins. You can do all sorts of interesting things, but that's the first kind of world that I think is got a lot of research possibilities to it still. And I don't think we've really fully understood it, and we can do better. The other one is the highly technical one. And I'll do my best to try to describe it, but the long and short of it is it's this technology called ZK SNARKs, zero knowledge proof. ZK SNARKs is, I think, the official term for it, but it's basically deals with what's called zero knowledge proofs. And this is a cryptographic primitive. It's actually an algorithm, I guess now. It's not even a primitive that manages to plausibly prove that somebody is who they say they are without actually saying they are who they say they are, which sounds contradictory or almost like a paradox, but it is really clever and novel how it works. And using that capability in a larger system can often give you some aspect of privacy, or give some of the benefits that the sidechain can give, but on the public chain. So you don't have to have this whole like mechanical 2-piece system that talks to each other and tries to do that. I believe they both, or I see them as both trying to solve similar problems. Sidechains also have an additional benefit, which they can often run faster. Blockchains are very slow for reasons we can get into later, but they usually run very, very slowly. And if you try to make a global economic network or a metaverse-based economic network, you need it to run much faster than they do today. Sidechains can also make them faster. ZK SNARKs, not as much to my knowledge, makes them faster, but it does bring privacy. So those two things I think are really promising. But to echo your point about Moxie Marlinspike's blog post, if none of you have read it yet, you should really look it up. It's a fascinating short read about a security expert's perspective on the Web3 and blockchain ecosystem. And one of the points he makes, which I completely agree with, is that we should be further along than we are today about that progress. And there are some people, again, working very hard to try to do this. So it's not that work isn't being done, but so much work is being done to try to get a quick buck through NFTs or something and basically scam people, where we could be actually building the core infrastructure that makes this work well for everybody in a much more a much less scammy way, I guess is a good way to put it. So other than those two, I'm sure there are many more, but if anyone knows in the audience, I would love to hear about the new things that people might be working on, because it's such a fast moving industry. It's exciting to see new possibilities and new white papers and academic research that's being done. I think that moves the whole industry forward.
Yeah, I completely agree. It is really interesting. And Moxie's piece was great. I think we linked, George may have linked to it in the chat. But I also, in sort of moving to what you just said about zero knowledge proofs and how it's still in the research phase, and I'll make one comment, which is I do think that people tend to chase the money, right? And so that's why I think scams were pretty popular, or not popular, but they were pretty rampant in blockchain for a while, where someone would do a ransomware and say, well, you have to send me Bitcoin, and sort of that whole underworld crime portion was there, and now we're turning to NFTs and the scams. But the interesting thing to me about the concept behind zero knowledge proofs is moving to another sort of privacy and security, I guess, idea for the metaverse, which is the one that's wrapped in identity. And I think it's a huge topic. I haven't fully unpacked it all myself, but it's sort of the concept of, do we still have to base our identity on our physical self?
Right.
Or is there, and even, do we have to have one singular identity in the metaverse? Can we have, I think when I think of an identity in the metaverse, I do think of an avatar type of situation, but, and I know that's not what people say you should be thinking about anymore, but can we have multiple avatars of ourselves in the metaverse? And how do we think about that? Because I think for as long as people have been alive, we've tied proving who you are to your physical being. I don't know, it's a very philosophical question, but I think it is a privacy and security one.
It is. I think it's it's actually, I appreciate that you brought that up, because I feel like that's the right way to approach this question. Humans have been social creatures for almost as long as we've been humans, probably as long. That's, I'm no, anthropologist, but I believe that, the social aspect, or what they call the networked human, had a huge play, my understanding, in the progress in which we made the ability to evolve and become modern humans. Even when you deal with things like in the creative sector, like creating music or writing music or things like that, they've almost always been collaborative. Like, you work with others. There's an other, and there's a you, and there's a community. And so when you think of your identity from a socio-humanistic standpoint, you have the you have the family you have the neighborhood you have the city, the state, the country, the global you, and someday there'll be a multiplanetary you. And so it's all of those things are true. They're all your identity. And so you have your online identity, and you might have different identities on different social networks. You might be like, I have a hobby of riding motorcycles, and so one of my social media, personas, identities is really just that, because I just focus on that for that one, because that's where I know other people in that space. And so I'm a different person or identity there than I am, for instance, in my professional career or my personal life, right? It's kind of like yes, and like all of those things are true. And so how does that translate to the metaverse? Maybe it's more simpler than we think. Maybe it's more similar to how we deal with social media, accounts today. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. I think we have a good idea of the pros and cons of social media and how it can interact with people's, psychological welfare, and some of the more nefarious aspects of social media, with like jealousy and comparing yourself with someone whose their persona isn't even real, it's completely doctored. And there's all sorts of things in there that we may not want to go down the road, but at least we know about them.
Yep.
But I do think you're right. I think that we can be all of those things. And I think that's one of the great benefits of a potential, I don't know if it's privacy first metaverse, but it's a human first metaverse. Like I'm very much of the mindset that we build technology for humans. We don't build technology for humans to then adapt to as much. Like, we should build it to fit the best parts of humanity. and then try to shore up the parts of humanity that still aren't quite there, the tribalism and the us and them, the othering. Like I believe that's a leftover from an earlier time of humanity, and we should probably try to get rid of it as fast as possible, and then put in modern structures to try to manage our way forward together. And so how do we apply that to the metaverse, I think, is really critical. And I think it does include all of those different things. I think you absolutely do allow people to have more than one identity. Let them control what they share out of it. Maybe Google was onto something with their circles concept back several years ago. Like you could have different levels of social connection, and you share less and less with the larger and larger group, and you share more and more with your lesser, because that actually mimics very closely how human social networks work outside of computers, to my knowledge.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think of Gen Z because I have 2 Gen Zers in my household, my kids, and they navigate the different social media platforms with a level of sophistication that I clearly do not have. And I think of it in the sense of that they've figured out who they want to be on each one of these platforms. I could definitely argue about the pros and cons of some of that, especially during the pandemic.
Indeed.
But I do think that there should be sort of an exploration of this idea of not necessarily needing to prove yourself based on who you are as a physical person, like that you live in this house. And I wrote this blog post for this webinar where I talked about you go to work, but you're doing it virtually. So you're wearing gloves and a vest and your goggles and all this kind of stuff. But can those, with the goggles, as you mentioned, the Oculus, there's a camera on it where you can turn the camera on so you can walk around your house and see with the goggles on, which means that it's able to record everything in your house. Does it have to do that? Just the whole concept of learning all this information about who you are as a physical person, like same story. Does my employer need to know if I go to the bathroom? Does my employer need to know if I'm clocking in or clocking out, just because the technology enables them to know that? That's sort of that dystopian thing. But so my point more being of different identities is a little bit of a freeing concept, but then everyone's going to go back to well, then how do you prevent someone scamming you? How do you prevent, because if you can't incarcerate someone for being a bad person, if there's no punishment, how do you prevent crime? And so I think that is a fascinating discussion that we really do have to dig into, of how do we trust people, not even people, it is people at the end of the day, as you just said, people are what's behind it. But if it's several different identities, how do you figure out that you can transact as an economical being, several economical beings, each of these other economical beings? And then, I think the mental health issues there are probably.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. You're absolutely right. It's, I think you bring up a good point around that. You reminded me of just have the ability of, it's almost like a selective disclosure. Like, could you selectively disclose as you built trust? Because identity and privacy has a lot to do with trust too, right? And like the more you trust an entity, the more you would disclose. I'm assuming the more you would disclose as needed to interact in whatever social contract you have. If it's economic, you're buying something, you need to disclose your credit card number, and and the bank needs to disclose that you have that money. And there's a couple of different things at play. You can almost think of these things as like little transactions, little requirements. And not to completely objectify this process and take the human out of it, but there's been some really interesting work recently in what's called the smart contract space, which tries to build a verifiable, trustworthy and deterministic way of actually transacting with each other, or with parties, entities. Could be like companies, whatever, not just people. But this world of smart contracts has gotten kind of swept into the Web3 world, and also kind of distorted. And it's unfortunate, because I feel like in that space, there could be many ways where we could choose the amount of disclosure needed for a particular transaction at a very fine-grained level. And so I feel like that's another part of Web3 that has been kind of distorted. Its concept has been distorted, and I feel like there could be more work being done there. There's one company that I'm a big fan of because I think that I'm just a really big fan of their technology. I don't know them as a company or as people, but there's a smart contract platform called DAML, DAML. Stands for Digital Asset Markup Language, I think, but it's basically a domain-specific language that lets you craft a very simple, human-readable software code that determines what a contract should be. And you can have it literally lifts everything from contract law, which is something that, you know, humans have spent a long time getting right, you know, from early, you know, English and UK-based, you know, efforts way back in whatever 1400s or whatever to try to, you know, put in modern common law and to kind of put it together. Like, to be able to make that computer readable, but have all the same structures that humans decide they need within contract law, I think is really promising. Because then, like, if I wanted to interact with someone, that, you know, we could have a contract, or they could submit a contract for consideration. I could be like, okay, what am I giving up? What do I accept? Am I okay with this? And I can choose every single time with this. And it's not like reading a terms and conditions where you have to read, you know, 25 pages. It would just be very simple, like kind of like you see on some social logins, like, you know, log in with Spotify, it will know your email address. Okay, fine, I'll do that, right? Almost like that. But I feel like there's so much more work we could do in that area. And I think any more fine-grained is probably worth examining, even though it might feel like it's heavier than this blanket. Like, if you want to use our app, then we get to do everything, like read your ear canal and your house with the camera. Like, that's not acceptable. Like, that's not acceptable. That's not a way forward. Now, they might think it's a way forward, but it's not a way forward for society, in my opinion. And there's many other ways for them to get what they want, if I agree. And they just don't get everything anymore like they used to. And I don't want to use the us and them too much, but, you know, there's a huge amount of data that big tech gets that is probably not necessary for me to interact with them. And it's not, it's egregious, I guess. I'm like starting to like show my personal suggestions or opinions at this point, but it's not necessary for them to offer the services that they're offering, and they can still make a huge profit in other ways. They have to bring real value to the people using them rather than just selling us as advertising. And so, you know, I think there'll be a shift perhaps if there's a stronger privacy requirement in the metaverse that is either mandated or just accepted, then there will have to be alternative income streams made that are probably not advertising based, if we're going to be able to wean the tech industry off of needing every single piece of information. Because if someone's paying you, they're no longer the product, and you don't need to know everything about them. If they continue to pay you because you're bringing a good service in, then that's a valid business model, and you can raise VC money off it and everything. So I think there's a way forward, but it's going to take them getting off of the the drug, basically.
Yeah, I I agree with you on that one. I mean, it's definitely one of my soapboxes is that some of these uses of the data, we don't even know the effects that they're going to have. You know, they could be a lot of mental health negative effects down the road. But we do have a question. We actually have two questions I see in the chat. So this is from George. How digestible will user-controlled pseudonymity operate when it's so challenged in Web 2? I have to think about that question.
A great question. I don't know if I have the answer to that. I'm not sure. I wish I did. If I did, there would be a good opportunity there. How would the pseudonymous identity be different than Web 2? Like, how do we solve the problems from Web 2 is the question.
Yeah.
I guess.
I mean,
I don't know. What do you think? Yeah. What are your thoughts?
I'm a little bit biased to the fact that we're even starting to have the discussion, right? So in Web 2, we didn't have the discussion until it's too late. And I feel like with Web 3, it doesn't exist yet. Or, I mean, some people are arguing it already does, but I don't think it does. And I think by starting to think about and explore these issues and start demanding, right? I mean, the Cisco report, and there was another report on privacy that came out that talks about how consumers really are demanding privacy, and of course anonymity and pseudonymity are part of it. So in my opinion, some people have different opinions, but I think it's very important. And so I think it's by having conversations like this.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, at the end of the day, like, we can choose with our interactions or lack thereof, right? I mean, that is kind of like the choose with your dollars, I guess, concept, but for online. And so, yeah, I think that's exactly right. And love it or hate it, efforts like GDPR, I think, are a step in the right direction. As companies, I'm sure many people on the call here have to deal with that all the time. Might be part of your job. It was certainly an issue with us in terms of dealing with working with European companies. And it's frustrating. Sometimes you're like, it's a whole nother thing. And it's like, yeah, it is a whole nother thing, but it's also like really nice that there's at least some structure now we can point to be like, hey, like how, and maybe it needs to be revised and things and whatnot, but at least we have something. Like there's a flag in the ground that says like, it's not okay. Like we don't want to just have free for all. But it's kind of like, I don't know. I think it could be solved. It could be addressed at least to some degree with some of these new cryptographic primitives. I think that cryptographic research is probably more important now than ever. And so, there might be, maybe there's a next generation of ZK snarks that just makes something happen that seems like it would be impossible. I can have privacy and identity. Like, how does that work? It doesn't exist today because it's a really hard problem, but it doesn't mean it can't be solvable. And so maybe there'll be something around that with Web3, and maybe we haven't made much progress is because the research isn't there yet, perhaps. But maybe it's not as lofty. Maybe it's something as simple as, like you said, just getting people involved and talking about it and deciding that we're wanting something different. And also offering alternatives, right? There's no one stopping anyone from having to use any particular service. There's, for almost every big service, there's 25 other options, and those are all available to most people.
Yeah, exactly. Follow privacy tech. Okay, so when we started this, I said I would end it at 5:50 because I like giving people like an extra 10 minutes to, I don't know, just before the top of an hour. Sure. And I feel like this is a good point to kind of end it on anyway, but I do want to do a couple of, again, housekeeping things before we do end, before everyone jumps off. And the first one is Security Expert Marketplace, who is the host and provider of the webinar series, is a community of security experts. They are always looking for new members, and of course, always there to help anyone who's looking for security advice. They wanted me to post their newsletter, and this is where we will also be posting any information on the series. The next series that we have, the next in this series of the 6 that are going to be about the metaverse, is to focus on NFTs. So it'll be in about a month, but we're going to focus on NFTs, specifically scams. It's a great panel. We have someone who is building an NFT company. We have a creator, and then we also have a security expert. So it's a good sort of collection of people to talk about that. So hopefully everyone here will join us. And if you subscribe to the newsletter, you'll be kept up to date. Allison, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for me.
This was so fun. It was.
It was.
I definitely could do this again. I may ask you to do another one if you're up for it.
Absolutely.
Thank you to everyone who joined us. I really appreciate your participation. Reach out to me on LinkedIn. Let me know if you have any questions or any thoughts. We want to keep this conversation going. It's a super important one, in my opinion. And until next time. So thank you.
Thank you.